Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Landscape Conservation's Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. My name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for the Network for Landscape Conservation. I'm going to share a brief welcome from the network, introduce the speakers we have today, and then go through some housekeeping logistics while we have you, and then we'll get the webinar started. So a brief overview of the network. We launched in 2011, and the Network for Landscape Conservation is the national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation. We strive to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. And we consider the network really a community as much as an organization, a community connected by the shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. We strive to create opportunities for the community to learn together, and for this reason, we're extremely excited to continue this webinar series into the winter and the spring. So I'll just do a brief introduction to the two speakers we have today. So today we'll be joined by Jake Faber, who's the Lens Growth and Partnership Manager for Upstream Tech. He's working to build partnerships across the conservation community to bring new perspectives to land protection and stewardship through Lens. And then we also have Ethan Inlander, a project director of Stewardship and Restoration for the Nature Conservancy in California. And he'll be sharing how he's helped develop and scale the use of the remote monitoring work across California and with partners nationwide. A few logistics, and then I'll hand it off to Jake. As we listen to the presenters today, please submit your questions in the chat or Q&A function on Zoom. Once the presenters are done, we'll be using the remaining 15 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. So with that, welcome Jake to present, and I appreciate you all being here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kat. Great to be here with y'all today. My name is Jake Faber. I work with Upstream Tech, heading up some of our partnerships with the land conservation community. Really excited to talk a little bit about remote monitoring today and some of the ways that that we have created some really neat opportunities thinking about landscape conservation. I'm excited to have Ethan Inlander with us today, who's a great partner of ours from the Nature Conservancy in California. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that remote sensing technologies can help us to bring new perspectives and solutions to our work in land conservation at landscape scale. We'll start off by going over some of the ways that just bringing some new perspectives to the work that we do using view from above can enhance some of our work just at a high level, and then get into the weeds a bit more on some of the mechanics around remote sensing and our Lens application that we've developed, as well as some examples of how you can put those perspectives into practice, and particularly focusing on some neat collaborations with partners both at TNC and with some other folks that we've been working with. And then we'll leave some time as well at the end for plenty of questions if you have them, but feel free to drop in the chat anytime as we're going through. So to get started with just some of the basics here, it's always nice, I think, to start off with just an image of what we're talking about. Using that view from above, here is the Choctawhatchee River Delta down in Florida. So, one of the things that we're always thinking about when we talk about landscape scale conservation is understanding the context of how the places that we're trying to protect are interconnected, how they fit into a broader portfolio of connected habitats, and how all of the work that we're doing on the ground just sort of all fits together in this broader puzzle. So getting an understanding of the impacts of our work at that kind of scale really relies on having a comprehensive way of envisioning the landscape and visualizing the work that we do. So to me, I think bringing this perspective of a view from above really gives us some powerful and insightful ways to conceptualize our work at scale. So for instance, we can see a much greater level of detail across a really large area than we might have time for if we just sent staff out into the field to gather information. We also can do a better job of understanding some of the interfaces between different habitat types. We can see linkages more clearly, assess potential threats from things like development or encroachments that are really central to making sure that we're able to do really worthwhile conservation work in the long term. And we also can use technologies that go beyond the ability of the human eye to perceive some really subtle changes on a landscape and understand some of the dynamics at play that really factor into some management decisions and other things that we're trying to accomplish day to day. So just again, looking at this example here, I think this is a great sort of demonstration of just why this can be really helpful, right? Imagine yourself out on this landscape. At any of the points that you see here, it's a really, sort of just rich landscape of this interface between wetlands and maybe some forest. In this coastal environment, there's just so much going on, so much that's probably in flux. You can imagine, for instance, that some of these river channels, maybe shifting with seasonal flooding. You can imagine that at different times of year, that coastline is going to look really different. And having this way of having a replicable view of this landscape in its entirety can be a really powerful tool that, as anybody who's used Google Earth before can attest. It's just a really worthwhile piece of information to bring with you into any of the work that you're doing to understand that landscape and protect it. So with all these really exciting opportunities to bring aerial and satellite imagery, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about today, to some of your work, I also just want to point out there's a huge value just simply in diversifying your stewardship toolkit or conservation toolkit more broadly. So we like to think of remote sensing as sort of a tool in tandem with things like going out for field visits, communicating with landowners, doing broader strategizing. And whether you're a practitioner or a planner, if you're on the front lines of monitoring and enforcement, or looking at that broader picture of setting strategy or planning out future conservation efforts, it's really important to have a diverse set of tools available to you to help you understand the landscape in as many different ways as possible. I think it's always helpful to see things in a new light and bring some different approaches to your work. And hopefully this offers a handful of those that you can consider. So maybe before we get too far into the weeds on some of the examples on how Ethan and others have made good use of some different remote sensing applications, it would probably be helpful to talk a little bit about what we mean by remote sensing and some of the basic features of some of the different options that you have to work with. So the way I always like to frame this just off the bat is remote sensing really is not that unfamiliar of a concept to you if you've used any of these or seen any of these tools in action before, right? It's all about sensing some sort of information from a distance, from a remote perspective, whether that's trying to capture information about the speed of a vehicle or temperature of a human body, or just taking a photo of something that's out in the landscape. All of that is sort of along the same lines of what we're thinking in terms of remote sensing. Now, specifically in this instance, what we typically are talking about is imagery, and that can be imagery that looks like a photograph, looks like what we would see just putting ourselves out on the landscape or above the landscape, as well as some other really neat tools to capture data. And all of that can sort of vary based on, for instance, where the sensors are located. You can think about a lot of very similar applications being deployed at really near to Earth's surface scale or much further away. And all of these tools have again, different trade-offs and benefits depending on what sort of applications you're looking for. So whether that's really close to the surface using a drone or a UAV, maybe doing some sort of aerial support, or getting imagery from a satellite source. Those all are sort of different ways of using remote sensing. It's not exclusively about satellites, not exclusively about aerial imagery. But specifically with satellites, because that's one area there's been a ton of growth in the last couple of years, and I know a lot of interest generally in accessing some of that data. These are some of the types of satellite data sources that we tend to talk about in the conservation space. And particularly, in our work with Lens, we do make a lot of these different data sources available. And so they're ones that I'm fairly familiar with and would be happy to answer some more questions about. But you've got a range, right, of public satellite operations that are run by government sources like NASA or the European Space Agency. Often those are publicly available data sources, as well as some typically higher resolution commercial data sources, which we can get into a little bit more later on looking at some examples. But this is one of the areas that I think has really contributed the most to some of the interesting developments that we've seen over the last couple of years in this space. And one of the reasons that we've been really excited to see more land conservation organizations in particular start using some of these is just that there's been a proliferation in the commercial satellite imagery market where there are a lot more vendors that are working in that space and a lot more images that are being produced on a daily or yearly basis, which means that there's just more out there for us to access. Typically, that means that there are also cheaper costs associated with that. And generally, it's just something that we're starting to understand more in the conservation world, how we can use those tools most effectively. Now, thinking about, again, any of these different scales, there are a couple of factors to consider in terms of just how those different technologies are operated and what that means in terms of how you can use them. So one thing that's really important to always think about is frequency. So are you talking about using a remotely sensed image that is captured one time only, or something that has a revisit rate of maybe as frequent as every couple of days, where you can get a consistent look at the landscape over time? Typically, there's a bit of a trade-off of frequency versus level of detail you can see in an image, which we'll get into in a moment as well. But besides just how often a satellite or aerial source is capturing data, we also like to think about what it is that they're detecting. Typically, this is somewhere on the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, right? So something that we're familiar with from high school physics. The light that we can see is a portion of this much broader spectrum of types of radiation that are coming down from the sun and reflecting off the Earth's surface. And different places on the landscape reflect that radiation in different ways. And sometimes we can tell what something is based on how it's reflecting that information. So for instance, here we can see that this particular satellite constellation that's operated by a company called Maxar, this Worldview 2, has actually 8 different types of data that it's collecting at a time. So it operates within different bands along that spectrum to show things that we can see from these blues, greens, yellows, up through the reds, as well as near infrared data, which is something the human eye cannot perceive. So some really neat ways that we can think about how to manipulate those technologies to show us things that, again, we just can't see ourselves a lot of the time. Now, besides what they're capturing and how often they're capturing it, something else you want to consider with remote sensing always is the level of detail that they can capture, or what we call spatial revolution. So here's some different examples of that in practice. So we can see, for instance, that across different scales, and again, thinking of the property scale to the landscape scale, this becomes really important. Thinking of how much detail can we see on the landscape? Can we see, for instance, where these roads are laid out? Can we see these particular structures that might be visible at a higher resolution, like a 50 centimeter resolution that we have over here compared to something coarser? All of that helps to inform what you're able to detect, how you're able to use this imagery. And so is always just something we like to keep front of mind. And typically there's a bit of a trade-off of frequency of how often imagery is available with what level of detail it is. So often, for instance, commercial satellites are really well equipped to get really high resolution images in a less frequent revisit than something like a NASA or European Space Agency image. And again, we can show some examples of those right here, actually. We can see that there are all these different ways then of using these different features of some of these tools to help us see the landscape in all these different ways that sometimes would just never otherwise be possible. So for instance, on the left, we've got a true color image, which is reflecting the landscape as we would see it, or as most of us would see it. You see mostly greens, you see the vegetation on the landscape, you see some of these wetland features really clearly at this fairly high resolution capture. We also then can use some different features, such as these images from the European Space Agency Sentinel-2 data, to detect things like vegetation productivity based on how strongly vegetation is reflecting some of those near infrared bands of the wavelength. We can do a similar thing looking at the moisture on the surface to detect things like drought. And we can also just totally invert how we look at the landscape by assigning certain colors that we recognize with different types of information, like parts of the infrared spectrum that are visible through this image, which is an aerial shot through the USDA's NAEP program. So just to give you a sense of some of the different ways that we can manipulate those tools, there's so much more out there, but all of these can help us to make really informed management decisions, planning decisions, and again, just help us to see the landscape in really neat new ways. So with all that in mind, I'd love to talk a little bit about just sort of how we come to this work at Upstream and some of the applications that we've seen for using Lens to help organizations partner to document some of these features and understand the work they do in new ways. So as a little bit of background, so Upstream Tech, we are a mission-driven tech company. We partner with conservation community, largely with a lot of land trust organizations, and we have a lot of really great partnerships with folks like PNC to develop some really neat opportunities to use remote sensing and machine learning to make those insights really easy to use. And primarily, our tool Lens is something that we developed a couple of years ago with a lot of help from TNC to make remote sensing accessible by creating this really easy to use web-based platform that's focused on primarily monitoring conservation efforts nationwide. Now, it's a web-based application, which means that it's designed to be as user-friendly as possible for folks who have anywhere on the spectrum of more advanced geospatial experience to total beginners who otherwise would have a really hard time overcoming some of the barriers to downloading, analyzing, interpreting some of this imagery. We also make it really easy to find commercial imagery from a bunch of different sources that we partner with, and to collaborate on interpretation of images using annotation and different analytical features, as well as some reporting tools. So that's just sort of, I guess, the overview of how we offer some of those tools to folks who want to take advantage of some of the remote sensing insights that can really enhance their work. So, again, really, we're all about helping to understand the greater context for some of the on-the-ground issues that conservation organizations are encountering, getting better insight into both past trends as well as what's going on right now on conserved land, whether you're talking about a very small couple of acres large property to something that has a bit of a broader landscape scale. And helping to build some really strong relationships by sharing data and observations and making it easy to just share that view together. And Ethan will also talk about this a little bit more later on with some neat examples from his work, but we also find that it's really helpful to save time and cost to make it really efficient to prioritize the limited resources that we often are working with in conservation. So a little just snapshot of sort of where we're at with Lens right now in terms of our partnerships. We have about 100 organizations right now who are using Lens to monitor over 13 million acres of land. These are among some of our partners that we work with, again, with a footprint sort of all across the country. And I would love to talk a little bit about some of the ways that those organizations are using Lens to enhance their work and get some perspective from that landscape scale. So one of the most common things that a lot of organizations are typically trying to understand when going out and observing the landscape is what potential threats there might be to the longevity of conservation protections that are put in place. So for instance, detecting things like encroachments and violations that could be threatening conservation values of a particular property, or also that might inform some of the prioritization of where on the landscape certain issues might be most likely to threaten wildlife or cultural resources. Now, restoration also is a really great way to use some of these tools to track progress of a given project. For instance, here we've got a neat example from Massachusetts of a wetland restoration effort that's been taking place over the last 15 years. And you can see some really dramatic changes by documenting that same perspective from above over time to see that restoration to a more natural state. Another, I think, really cool application of some of this is tracking timber harvests as well, and just different changes in vegetation patterns on the landscape. Really easy to use both true color imagery to see where that green cover has been eliminated from the landscape, as well as relying on some of the vegetation indices using some of those other spectral resolutions to detect where tree cutting has happened, where forest cover that may be an important linkage between habitats has been lost, and again, to factor into prioritization. Similarly, thinking about different potential threats for vegetation cover and forest habitats in particular, wildfire is, especially across a lot of the Mountain West, as everybody knows these days, a really prevalent just reality of every season. And you can see, for instance, at a really fine scale, the impacts of some of that on the landscape overall. We can track, for instance, using some of this publicly available European Space Agency data. Every 5 days, we have a data point of how much vegetation productivity there has been on this landscape. And we can see a very sudden drop that helps us identify when fire impacts really began here, and then to track the recovery over time. Again, using really replicable data. Similarly, pest infestations are also a really neat application of some of this. And again, that's something that transcends property boundaries a lot of the time. For instance, here on this property in Vermont, we can see over the course of the season, the dip in midsummer forest cover associated with invasive moth activity that sort of cut into some of the midsummer productivity of that forest cover. So with all of that, just to give you some ideas of some of the ways that these tools can be used, I would love to get a little bit more into how individual organizations have found these opportunities using remote sensing to really enhance their work. And Ethan, I'll leave it to you for a little bit to talk about how this is played out within TNC.
Great, thank you, Jake. It was helpful to sort of see through all the technical issues and themes related to remote monitoring. We always want to cover that as a background. And it is multidimensional. It's a lot of these themes are interwoven. But I wanted to step back and sort of start from a programmatic perspective as a large land trust. And so just starting off with our real estate portfolio in California, obviously we have a very diverse state. I think there's 10 ecoregions, depending on how you define those. And, a lot of the properties that we have conservation ownership in include working cattle ranches, working forests and farms, as well as more intact habitats. And our conservation goals include water and land and nature and people. So it's a challenging environment to work, but we can look at our portfolio next. So in California, the Nature Conservancy, under our current conservation investments, we have about 150,000 acres in fee ownership that we own and manage primarily as preserves, but those include farms as well. We have about 175 conservation easements or deed restrictions that comprise 350,000 acres. So quite a bit more of our portfolio is in conservation easements than in ownership. And I think that highlights the role of private landowners or public agencies as the holder of that property, as a partner with us in managing this portfolio. We manage one pretty large property for the state of California. And then in gray, you sort of see that there's a 500,000 additional acres of property that we've worked with our partners over the years. Either we've purchased the property and then transferred it to a local land trust or local, state, or federal public landowner, or we've assisted in that transaction. So that's clearly an important part of how we work, is with a wide range of partners. And if you look at the map, it highlights, I think, one of the themes of the network is that we try to work generally at a landscape scale. So we're, the unit of conservation is an individual property, but those are taken in the context of a larger, say, ecoregional conservation plan or partner priorities, and fall into a matrix of much larger holistic conservation efforts. So that is something we've always done, and continues to be an important part of what we do. You do see sort of one-off properties here and there. There was an opportunity or a sort of rare or unique conservation value that we wanted to protect, but in general, the bulk of our work is in these large landscapes. So the next slide, please. So fee ownership has a huge value in that fee properties, the preserves where we own the underlying fee, we can treat those as platforms for demonstrating novel conservation techniques, for bringing people out to those properties, and really leveraging our investment in that property to serve our broader conservation strategies, our goals for protecting land, water, oceans, climate, for bringing broader audiences and partners out to engage on those properties. Next slide. But fee ownership has, oh, and sorry, I'll sit back and say, and that's, in a broad sense, what we, how we use these properties. We innovate how we're doing restoration. We're translocating species. We're doing research and education and fundraising. And so our fee properties are a huge part of that. Next slide. But fee ownership has a bunch of additional responsibilities and challenges and obligations associated with managing the property, managing leases and things like that. So next slide. That emphasizes why, one of the many reasons why conservation easements are the majority of the acreage that we hold in California. They serve as an efficient way to accomplish conservation in partnership with the landowner who manages that property to those conservation goals. Now, a big part of our ongoing obligation on those properties, sometimes we reserve the right to do restoration or outreach or research on those properties, but our annual ongoing obligation is always conservation easement monitoring, and that's all 175 properties every year. And that's a big part of what our staff are doing. Next slide, please. And those same staff that are doing annual monitoring are the same staff that are leading our research, education, restoration, are supporting our transactions teams to protect new properties. And so it's critical that we sort of do this work as effectively as we can to ensure that the conservation values we've invested in are intact, but also that we do it as efficiently as we can, because we have so many other strategic goals that are required to see our broader conservation goals met. And so, next slide. One of the ways we've tried to approach that maintenance of both the effectiveness but also the efficiency of our monitoring over time has been to explore remote property monitoring. And that's been really as far back as 2004 that we've really explored that, but especially starting around 2014. And some of the broad categories that I think Jake has covered is sort of the characteristics of the imagery we use, the platform, say the software platform that we're using to do that remote monitoring, and the practices of how we do that. And so really 2014 to 2018 was exploratory. We were using drones, we were using Google Earth imagery, which is primarily airborne imagery. We were using some of the public satellites that Jake was talking about. The platform was either Google Earth or sometimes Google Earth Engine, which is a sort of a programming environment where we can pull some of those public satellite data to get mostly at our rangelands habitat and grazing intensity and things like that, annual pressure on those rangelands. And the practices were pretty rudimentary. We were cutting and pasting imagery and then uploading them into Salesforce, sort of hand annotating on Google Earth. So we had partnered with Upstream Tech earlier on a different project, actually a really cool remote sensing project for migratory bird habitat. And so in 2019, we worked together, us as a client and them as the developer, to explore modifying a platform that they had already developed into what is now Lens, which is specifically engineered around our use case, which is for annual remote monitoring, primarily conservation easements, but also our fee properties. And it was really our first endeavor into commercial satellites. And so where that ended up after that first year pilot was a really workable product, something we wanted to keep moving forward with, the integration of Lens into Salesforce. So if we make an observation in Lens from remote imagery, it appears in our annual monitoring reports. That was a really key part of the efficiency. And also the practices, we really started to develop more of a systematized way of conducting remote property monitoring for our staff. So in 2020 in California, we fully implemented remote property monitoring, meaning we could remote monitor on any of those 200 plus fee or easement properties in the state. We trained up our entire monitoring staff. And we also worked with 13 other TNC chapters in the US, as well as 2 countries, to pilot Lens as a tool to serve both their annual compliance monitoring needs as well as other ecological monitoring needs. And the timing for that with COVID and travel restrictions and all of that everyone is familiar with created it. It was an opportunity, even though it was a huge challenge. So we were able to provide that option to conduct remote monitoring to 14 states as well. So it was a good opportunity to not only make that available, but to really broaden the sort of community within TNC for using Lens and conducting remote monitoring generally. Next slide, please. So this is just a map of those business units within TNC that were piloting in 2020. And you can see it's from pretty much all regions of the US. And next slide, please. An important part of what we wanted to understand out of that 2020 pilot with, I think 10 of the participating chapters contributed data into this, is an analysis of the return on investment. So there's the cost of monitoring a property in person versus the cost of monitoring it remotely. And so the in-person includes, the travel to and from some of these properties in California. I'll drive 4 hours each way to go monitor a property. There's the time it takes to prepare, read last year's report, conduct the monitoring, write this year's report, versus the remote monitoring costs, obviously. So there's costs associated with the Lens license, the imagery we purchased for that property, and then the time it takes to conduct the remote monitoring. And what we found, and this is across 10 chapters, on average, it found a 58% savings in personnel time and a 28% reduction in overall costs, whether that's personnel time, travel expenses, imagery costs, et cetera. And so, the 28% is important, but I think more importantly, for at least how we think about it in California, is that 58% time savings of those same staff who are working on our strategic goals of restoration, new transactions, outreach and education, fundraising, science, all of those things. So we free up capacity within that same team to do more of the forward-looking work that we want to do. With, there's trade-offs in remote monitoring, but what we think is overall at least as effective, or maybe in some ways more effective, approach to monitoring. So if we go to 2021 in California, we monitored 78% of our easement portfolio acreage solely remotely monitored. remotely. And so, we've had a trend over time from our first pilot year of 43% to 54%, now to 78%. We worked with Upstream to incorporate fully our rangelands remote monitoring functions that help us, because something like 60% of our easements are actually working cattle ranches. And so it's important that we not only assess property encroachments and buildings and structures and new roads and clear cuts and things like that, but also what are the conditions of the rangeland. So we invested a bunch of time and work with Upstream this year to build that function out. And then, as Jake mentioned, the public satellite tools are really, and the commercial satellite tools are really effective ways of tracking post-fire, both the extent of the fire, the intensity, and also the rebound over, some of the burned areas on easement properties burned 2 or 3 years ago, so we can sort of see how they recover over time as well. So that's been a really powerful tool. And the return on investment for 2021, we haven't tabulated that yet, but we really expect it to be even more effective in terms of returning our time and reducing our costs. So with those, with that progression over, really since 2014, and really finding in the last few years huge value, both in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of our work, we recently partnered with the Land Trust Alliance. Next slide, please. And at the beginning of 2021, we established a grant program in partnership with the LTA to provide to provide funding and a forum for land trusts to experiment with remote monitoring. And because we recognize that the practice is new to a lot of folks, the technology is new, and we wanted to remove the risk of that cost investment in experimenting with a new approach, and sort of create a way that land trust can see if this works for them and to share what they find. And so we had, I think, something like 30 plus applicants and selected 18 recipients. We wanted to make sure that those land trusts represented the diversity of not only the regions of the US, the habitat types, but also the sizes of those organizations. So how does remote monitoring work for a small volunteer-led organization versus a larger organization like the Nature Conservancy? And so that was year one, and we're just wrapping that year up with that cohort. And there's actually another 2022 cohort that are applying. I think the applications are due actually the end of this week for members of the LTA. And, so the goals of the program obviously are to build capacity toward remote monitoring, making these tools more accessible, exploring new approaches, learning through practice, and most importantly, peer learning. So if a land trust in the future wants to approach remote monitoring, they can look to the resources that come out of this grant program and see how, what types of technologies worked for land trusts similar to their own, whether it's similar in geography or similar in organizational structure, similar in technological background, whatever it may be. And so, I guess next slide, please. So coming out of both our sort of experimentation from 2014 to the present, also working with 20 plus TNC chapters across the US, also working with 18 land trusts across the US over the past year. The challenges that we've seen and heard expressed, and that we've all sort of experience together are challenges sometimes are a lack of imagery availability, especially in that high res category, which is often needed for remote monitoring. That spatial resolution is sometimes not fine enough to look at the issues that we're considering. The cost of imagery can be prohibitive. A monitoring platform, the cost of access to that platform can be prohibitive. The platform, the functions of the platform or the interoperability might be, not as robust as you would hope, or the community of practice or knowledge base, especially early on, was sort of non-existent. Just, there's a few papers here and there, a few presentations here and there of people experimenting in all this. But the trends, and especially over the last year and a half, I would say, the availability of high-res imagery has increased. The spatial resolution and the availability of high-resolution imagery has increased. The costs of imagery are generally coming down. The cost of the monitoring platforms are also coming down, while the platforms are becoming more functional and more interoperable. So Lens speaks to Salesforce for us, or the imagery that we have in Lens can also be available in one of our other web-hosted imagery servers, et cetera. And again, most importantly, the community of practice and the knowledge base is growing through the grant program that we have, through just a broader group of folks participating in LTA forums. And so a lot of the drivers of all of these are the commercial market is competitive, and that's both for imagery and for the platforms like Lens. That competition helps to drive quality up and prices down. The economies of scale. So as the land trust community grows, and as our purchasing power increases, Lens Upstream Tech can negotiate better prices for us as their clients because they have more clients, and same for other companies in the market. The diversity of practitioners. So as I mentioned, like with our grant program, we really wanted to understand not just how it works for us as a large, organization, but how it works for other smaller organizations, different geographies, and that's obviously grown. LTAs led the way in terms of being a central source of information and holder of information that people can share through the LTA to their peers across the US. And regional partnerships have become more and more important as whether it's land trusts or public partnerships, private public partnerships, the knowledge sharing within those partnerships, and also the purchasing power within those groups has really helped to facilitate broader adoption. And so I think I'll hand it back to Jake here to talk a bit more about some of those partnerships that he's worked with.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. I think that's always really helpful to just hear about some of the specifics of how an organization can implement some of these sorts of approaches. Just to offer a couple of other quick examples, particularly from some folks who are involved in that Alliance grant program. We've seen some really interesting examples of at a local scale, organizations collaborating who are working in similar footprints. For instance, in Maryland, we have the Maryland Environmental Trust as well as the Lower Shore Land Trust collaborating to track riparian buffers, for instance, on some of their properties. Similarly, we also have worked out some really interesting partnership opportunities with land trust state associations to try and expand just regional adoption of some of these tools, again, to facilitate some of the peer learning opportunities. But we've been really excited to support the Vital Ground Foundation, Kinixu Land Trust, and the Idaho Department of Lands on some work they're doing over an overlapping service area to help monitor and manage grizzly habitat, for instance, with some really neat projects looking at some tree planting after wildfire, as well as some forest thinning. And then just one other kind of cool one that I want to highlight as well, Colorado Open Lands, which also is a partner of Keep It Colorado, who we've got a great partnership going with as well, monitoring mountain pine beetle impacts, again, using some of those vegetation index layers to detect some things that typically just are really difficult to see and identify the scale of moving, again, beyond individual boundaries. So with that, we've got, I want to leave some time for questions. So I'll just jump ahead here and just sort of recap that, in conservation, we're always trying to do more with less, and leveraging partnerships, using new tools are always great ways to do that, I think. So with tools like Lens that are making remote sensing accessible for any of us to get started with, it helps us to, I think, bring a clearer focus to the big picture, to protect land with a greater value than just some of its acres. Being able to look across the entire landscape to achieve some of those larger goals is really important. And this all just fits into those goals of conserving functional, connected landscapes that help us to maintain high standards of care for those places that we're going to need to protect. And at the end of the day, these approaches really support us in working together more effectively and efficiently to do more conservation. So with that, feel free to drop some additional questions in the chat. Also, our contact info is here for folks that and I see we had a question from Mara about adding other data layers to remote sensing. Maybe I'll stop this share for a moment and pull up an example of that while we wait for some more questions to come through.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. That'd be great. So please feel free to use the chat. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. Please continue to put questions in there. And then, yeah, Jake, if you want to start with that first one that Mara put in. And I'll just say it out loud so everyone can see it if they're not looking at the chat. Can you add other data layers to your remote sensing images? For example, land ownership and tenure, or indigenous cultural values or known species migration routes?
Yeah, so this is one thing that I think is really neat about having the ability to stack images that are, and also vector data that are captured, just like from that view from above perspective, right? Is again, we talked about the replicability of that. And one thing that's really valuable about having those sorts of images is that you can layer on whatever types of information are most helpful. So for instance, here in Lens, we've got, again, this is the same wetland restoration property that I mentioned earlier. We can see, for instance, like some of the Massachusetts state wetland layers that we can really easily identify where on this property, and like transcending the property boundaries as well. We have some of those features on the landscape. Similarly, we also recently added another, we also have some building footprints that can also help to identify developed areas, as well as things like parcel data. So seeing who adjacent landowners are, understanding, again, just like where those trends are that go beyond the property boundary, and understanding the context of what's surrounding those priority areas that we're working with. So hopefully that helps to answer the question.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jake. And to kind of gear it towards, I think one thing that I have noticed is even though you have the property boundary itself, I know that Lens also works outside of that boundary when you guys are working out. So you could talk a little bit about that, just to share that image benefit.
Yeah, and that's one kind of neat thing too, is that we, basically specifically within, the way we structured the application, you can pull in imagery for any area of interest, whether that's a property that you're looking at where you want what's within that boundary, although we do also know that, looking at things like encroachment is always really important. So we always sort of kick in this buffer area, but, it may be the case that you're looking at a larger area where you're considering potential acquisitions. It may be the case that you're looking at particular corridors that go beyond individual parcels of land. And so in any of those cases, having access to imagery that's consistent and that you can go back and revisit is really important. So we definitely recognize that and make it easy for folks who are looking to do that sort of work to get in and find that data.
Great, thanks so much. And this question can go to Ethan, kind of focusing on the remote monitoring. You had discussed the trend of increasing remote monitoring across California. So Mara is curious to know, is that expected to replace in-person visits, or how does that work in tandem with the remote monitoring?
Yep, very relevant question. So the Land Trust Alliance, or the guidance that we operate under as an accredited land trust, is we have to field visit a property, boots on the ground, once every 5 years, at least once every 5 years. So that's sort of the minimum requirement that we sort of formulate our model around. And on the one hand, the remote sensing adds a ton of perspective that we can't get on the ground, especially on these larger, more rugged properties. But on the other hand, it's important to be on the ground to see maybe individual species or individual invasive plants, or often, most importantly, to meet with the landowner and get a sense of how their year is going, to maintain the relationship that we have. So there's an important trade-off in those factors for us in California, but we can make that trade-off as long as we understand it, and we are working toward a model that's probably on, say, an average property, which maybe there's no such thing, but on average, we would visit a property maybe every 3 years instead of every 5 or every year, somewhere in the middle. But we keep track of that, and obviously, if there's something like a violation or a project that the landowner wants to conduct that requires approval, that we really need to see the site beforehand or sign off on it after it's implemented, that might trigger a site visit. But we're sort of moving to a model where some of the remote monitoring might be done by somebody who's more of an expert in remote monitoring, and then there's a person who's more of the local contact that would maintain that relationship that they've built over years or decades and conduct the site monitoring when needed. But as I said, sort of the diversity of organizations doing remote monitoring is broadening, and that's been really helpful for us to understand that our approach is works for us, but is not the default of all organizations. And so one of the participants in the grant program, at the beginning of the program, they said, hey, look, you guys are talking about return on investment. That all makes perfect sense. But we're going to go to every property every year. And our return on investment is going to be that the remote monitoring is going to add to our understanding of the property, of the changes over time, not a replacement either or. And that was great to see and to understand. And one of the outcomes of this year within one of the participants, another participant in the grant program, did their return on investment analysis of costs of remote monitoring versus field monitoring, and they actually field and remote monitored some properties, and said that even though they did both at the same property, that still ended up reducing their costs, because they, instead of driving around the property for 8 hours trying to look at all these remote places that they really couldn't get a good look at anyway, they went to this property, met with the landowner, looked at the really high risk areas, the development areas, the high use areas, and then conducted the majority of that more monitoring of those rugged areas remotely. And that penciled out to a savings, even though they sort of leveraged the benefits of both approaches on the same property in the same year, and still, it ended up costing them less, which is really good to know. So, every organization is different. Their model is different. Their sort of interest or of solely remotely monitoring a property varies, and it's been really enlightening for us to see that range of approaches. And I think it'll be important for the land trust community to see that there's a variety of ways of thinking about it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ethan. I have a million questions, but I'm going to stick to the ones in the chat right now. And since we're running a little bit low on time. One question that came in, are any federal agencies using this tool at this time? And if so, who and for what and why? That's the first part. And then there's a second part, but I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, definitely there are federal agencies that have been using some of these tools in various capacities, right? Thinking again back to how we discussed earlier, that remote sensing encompasses not just some of the swanky newer like commercial satellite imagery types of options, but there are all sorts of tools that I think a lot of them are not all that new, right? There are a lot that have been used and really well instituted at certain agencies for years. I'm thinking particularly of NRCS, who has been using aerial monitoring of their easement portfolio for a long time, and now are starting to consider transitioning to some other types of platforms. I can say that specifically with Lens, we do work pretty closely with folks at the Forest Service through the Forest Legacy Program, doing some monitoring work. I've got a colleague who works more closely on some of our agency partnerships, who I'm sure would be happy to talk more if you've got specific questions on that front. But yeah, it's definitely, I'd say, a conversation that's happening across nonprofit and agency sectors. And I guess just one thing to consider with agencies is I think thinking of the context of like how a lot of organizations we work with came into this. A lot of smaller organizations in particular are more nimble to respond to things like the COVID pandemic last year that prevented folks from fulfilling their usual monitoring obligations. And this became a really easy opportunity for folks to quickly pivot. And I think then there are also some broader conversations happening about, just the value of these tools across the board for larger institutions that have, a little bit more to work out in terms of internal protocols around that. And that I think ties back a little bit to the earlier question that Ethan was getting to around, some of the cadence of using in-person versus remote methods. I think that's something that across the board is going to vary by organization depending on your specific priorities. Before I worked with Upstream Tech, I started over the summer and had previously been with the Land Trust Alliance. So I feel like I always have to say, keep in mind standards and practices for anybody who's working on land conservation, talk to the folks at the Accreditation Commission. Everybody's thinking about these sorts of things and how to support organizations that want to do that work. But aside from that, there are each agency, each organization is going to have their own individual, sort of approaches to keep in mind. There are always going to be certain places that are better or worse candidates for implementing different approaches. So something to consider there, whether you're focused on more the land trust side of things or more agency based.
That's great. Thank you. And I think there's a very kind of specific question here that kind of goes in tandem with that. So maybe Jake, connecting folks to kind of the federal partnership opportunities, but I just want to say it out loud, and then I think we have to start wrapping up, unfortunately. But one thing to consider is, do you know if these specific tools meet some of those federal grantee monitoring requirements? And I think, as you mentioned, there's this ongoing conversation around how do we meet those requirements? How do we make sure we're meshing these priorities together? And as you said, it looks different. Both you and Ethan said very well, it looks different. Each organization is going to tackle it in a different way. So I really appreciate that context and the information, and all the incredible examples you guys provided. It was really helpful to see how it could play out in action. I expect we'll have a lot more questions. So please put them in the chat so we can capture them if we have not gotten to any. And I know that Jake and Ethan will be happy to connect after this if needed. But I just wanted to send a big thank you to both Jake and Ethan for this time to learn from you today. So overall, this webinar is a part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation and Action webinar series. There's going to be a recording of this webinar posted on the network website. And I will put a link to the website here. So for anyone who wants to reference this or get their contact information off the recording, there it is. And we will have all the recordings from past and future webinars moving forward. And then in February on the 17th, at 1 p.m., we're going to have another webinar focused on Sentinel Landscape Partnerships. That's coming up in the middle of February, focusing on a coalition of federal agencies, state and local partners to protect and advance sustainable land management practices around military installations and ranges with private landowners. So something to look forward to. But as always, we're just very appreciative of the audience today and the questions that came in. Extremely grateful for your participation, Jake and Ethan. And we look forward to having you all engage with the Network for Landscape Conservation moving forward. So we hope you have a great rest of your day, and please keep in touch. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.